Hi, good morning. We're going to take a little bit of time this morning to start letting people roll in. I have noticed that lots of people are asking me questions throughout the week, so I want to take it slow as we get started this morning. So you've got, of course, myself and Joe Hilliard. Joe gets to be behind the mic, but he likes to jump in from time to time. And he's certainly going to jump in at the very end today to take some time to talk about backyard chickens. We have been doing this backyard garden live from my business page, but then doing everything we can to share it as quickly as we can to some of the other pages that we use for disseminating content. We just have discovered that over the 5 or 6 weeks that we started this as a fun adventure to let our friends know what we were doing in our backyard garden is now becoming a lot more essential to all households. And so I want to really take time to tell you what this morning's show is going to be about. First things first, it rained yesterday, which I was hoping for on Friday, but we did get a nice rain yesterday. It was actually really nice to know that it was cool and comfortable outside and it was raining, and so there was, we could just pretend like it was a rainy day and we're hanging out inside because it's a rainy day. And so I spent some time doing some potting over on my porch. And just getting some repotting of some plants. And now today I'm going to do my part to get back out in the garden. Tell you a couple of things. Yes, Joe?
Yes, ma'am.
You need me. What would you like?
Well, I was just going to say that if anyone has any questions at the end of when after you talk about what we're talking about, they can we'll do a Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to do a Q&A.
And then I'll talk about chickens. Mm-hmm. But I want to say this up front about chickens. You know how when the 101 Dalmatians came out and everyone went to go get Dalmatians and then they didn't like their Dalmatians, right. So they took their Dalmatians to the pound?
Right.
Chickens is not a hasty decision.
Please do not run out and buy chickens.
Unless, and then we'll talk about that at the end.
Yeah, we'll talk about that at the end. However, just know that what we're saying is do not go out and buy chickens. I will tell you, everyone that has asked me, and there's been 2 or 3 or 4 people that have asked me, right now is not the time to buy baby chicks. Not just because of what's going on in life, but it's literally not the right time to buy baby chicks.
We're about to hit the summer.
Yeah. So things that we're going to do today. We're going to make a tour through the garden because it rained. We'll do that real quick. Garden number 1, garden number 2. We'll land in garden number 2 where I'll talk about permaculture, rain and mulch, weeding, fungi in your soil, squash and squash blossoms. You're going to start to see that. Talk about planting more seeds. We're also going to talk about flowering vegetables. Be sure to talk about how your shade is about to change. Let's also talk about some other things. And of course, at the very end, hold your questions. No, I take that back. Don't hold your questions. Ask your questions now as the show is going on. And I'll do everything I can to answer questions at the end. And then Joe's going to talk about chickens, and we're going to talk more about questions you might have about having chickens. All right, so let's give a tour of the garden. Go ahead, Joe, and just show us around.
What are we looking at?
So you're looking at Cuban oregano, you're looking at lots of radish, you're looking at kale, you're looking at a moonflower datura plant over there, salvia, you're looking at kale into the caterpillar season. You're looking at a vining plant that's good for any fence line vining. Lots of flowers. You can see the cabbage there, onions. You're seeing my marigolds, lots of kale. This is a longevity spinach, which is an edible landscape, very valuable. We made some creamed spinach with it the other day. It was fantastic. Onions, all oregano over there, kale, lots and lots of kale. All kinds of green, more longevity spinach, lavender. I drank a cup of lavender yesterday. That's some Swiss chard right there. And lettuce, more Swiss chard, salvia.
When you say Swiss chard, lettuce, obviously edible.
Lots of good stuff there. So cilantro, we'll talk more about that during flowering, when it's time to talk about flowering. Come around to this side over here. Yes, you can see lettuce and more spinach. You can see this tomato plant over here is putting on tomatoes. Come around over here. Some flowering cabbage, some habaneros that are starting to put on over there.
Oh, we're actually getting peppers?
Yep.
Oh.
This is that indigo salvia I've been talking about for a few weeks that would finally start to blossom. The hummingbirds and the pollinators love that. all the arugula here. You can see my basil is starting to flower.
When your arugula is starting to flower, can you still eat it, or when does it begin to not taste so
You
good?
can still eat it. No, you can still eat it anytime. And the seeds are edible, so. Tomatoes. Snapdragons I planted by seed are now flowering beautifully. I put all this marigold in so to make sure I had marigold.
You just threw those snapdragon seeds onto the dirt and watered it.
No, I planted those in pots.
Oh, in pots, and then you bring them over.
Yeah, I'll show you one here in a minute.
Okay. More
the caterpillars are definitely out. They're starting to eat all your a lot of greens, especially the thicker greens and stuff like that. All right, let's head over to the other garden and show that off on our way this way.
I'll talk about this during the chicken part at the end.
Please, if you have questions, be sure to ask them now as the show's going on, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. So, if
you just started trying to garden, maybe you're a little lost or there's a lot of information, you can ask questions and Asen will love to answer them.
Yep. And this is the new garden. This is the garden that was ready to plant in January, toward the end of January, and I started planting it in February, and then mid-February started heavily planting it. So this is a very new garden, and I'll talk about that a little bit here in just a minute.
I'm noticing over here a lot of containers. You just put stuff in containers.
Yes, I'm just planting as much as I can plant. Just plant, plant, plant.
We got the trellising up from last week.
Yeah, if you watch Just Talk About Trellising, you can see that. I've got a bamboo that someone planted bamboo years ago, and of course it's a little bit invasive, and so we cut it back and then I use it as much as I can. As you're looking around, you're seeing cucumbers.
Yeah, tell me the plants. I don't know these plants.
Cucumbers, sunflowers. This is calendula. My zinnias are starting to come up. I've got tomatoes in the back there. You can see beans, tomatoes, basil. I'm planting lots of basil. This is a Cosmo flower that was in a nice seed mix. There's a real pretty pink one there in the back. Those have just started flowering.
And if you look at the episode from several weeks ago, like 4 or 5 weeks ago, there was no green over here.
No green, and now there's all kinds of green. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is permaculture gardening, and that's the type of gardening that I do here. Using lots of mulch, using a style called a hugelkultur bed. That's what these beds are. Another way that you might describe that is just calling it a berm, planting in a berm. That's kind of an old way of doing it as well. It's another style of raised. It's cheaper. You don't have to worry about building using wood that's got chemicals in it that you don't want outside of just collecting tree trims and things like that. So now's a good time. Any time's a good time to begin building your beds. And with the building of this bed, it was just literally collecting clean stuff that people have cleaned off their trees and then building that pile up. Now, after a rain is when you begin to understand even more so why there's so much value in permaculture gardening. For one thing, it's the plants just begin to protect each other. They're giving each other shade, or they're covering for no rain. I work to kind of try to keep things cleaned up so that I'm giving things the sun and rain options that they need, taking them away when it's too crowded, too much. But one of the things that's really important was I have begun to get to the point where I'm trying to figure out how to not overwater while I'm still seeding. So when you seed, you want to make sure your soil is always wet. But once the plants are starting to come up, especially in our region in Zone 9B and coastal regions, when you're dealing with this muggy, wet, warm and wet season, that's when you deal with mold, mildew, blight, and all of those things. So you want to try to keep things wet, but not so wet that they mold. So one of the things I've been doing recently over the last couple days while it was real windy and this movement has happened is that I've been watering in the sunniest, windiest part of the day, which generally they encourage that not to happen, to not waste water. But one of the things that's important is that we're trying to keep our seeds wet. So I need to keep my soil wet, but I don't want my leaves wet. So I'm trying to water during the mid parts of the day and not at the very end of the day at the nighttime. And I'm trying to do it when the wind will dry the leaves and the sun will dry the leaves. Rain, however, is extremely valuable because it's completely different than your city water or your tank water. It's got different kinds of nutrients in it. It doesn't have the same types of chemicals that we use to clean our water for reuse. And so it's got nitrogen in it. It's got all different types of energy in it. And it, especially a rain like what we had yesterday, a lot of rain comes in a long period of time. So it's not a hard, crazy thunderstorm, crash your dig, make your seeds harder in the soil. No, it's a nice steady rain. And what that does in a hugelkultur or permaculture garden, it's very, very value is it gets everything wet, right? So if it gets everything wet, that moisture stays inside the raised bed and stays in there to where now your soil will stay wet. The roots of your plants have access to water, and you don't have to come out and water. So you may be able to get away with 3 or 4 days, especially if you've got you had a nice planting right before the rain happened. You may be able to go 3 or 4 days without even watering. So that's some important stuff to do. Now, make sure you're continuing to put down mulch, because mulch absorbs the water. In this garden, you can see that I actually now have more moisture in the garden than just in my beds, because I've got the mulch there as well. Another thing that's really important, I don't currently have a lot of weeds in this garden because it's a very new garden, and I used my chickens. Yes.
It paused there for a little while. You were saying that you don't have a lot of weeds right now?
Right. I don't have a lot of weeds right now. And so part of the reason I don't have a lot of weeds right now is because I want to, you're getting me off track. What do you need over there, bub? I'm sorry.
When the video pauses and no one can see you, go ahead. We are live.
Okay, gotcha. So making sure that you're keeping the moisture in the soil, making sure that you're weeding. And right now is an important time to weed, especially if you have a bigger garden that's a couple of seasons old. Make sure you're pulling out all that clump grass right now. The ground is moist. The ground is soft. So if you are trying to clean up a bed and get those weeds out, right now is the absolute best time to do it,
because it rained and the
ground is
it's just
softer.
easier to do.
That's exactly right. So, and it's a nicer, cooler day. Do it right now, because as the day goes on, it's supposed to get a little bit warmer, so it's going to be muggy, and you're not going to want to be outside because it's hard to breathe when it's muggy outside. So one of the other things, let me show you this. I came out here this morning and I noticed that. You see that yellow? Looks like somebody sprayed some kind of
silly string
on there. Well, that's fungi. And you've heard me talking about mold and mildew, and you've heard me talking about, man, we got to get rid of that and whatever. However, when you see fungi in your soil, and let's see, there's another piece over here. You see this little bit of red starting to come in right there?
Put your finger near it. Yeah.
Okay.
It's like
same kind of thing. There are different kinds of fungi that are about to grow in your soil. Fungi is a very essential nutrient, a very essential body of being in your soil, especially when you're trying to grow annual vegetables. When you're trying to grow annual vegetables that require access to all different types of nutrients, they need a system, a mycorrhizal fungi system. The mycorrhizal fungi system is essential in your soil, which is part of the reason why we talk about the no-till concept and we talk about permaculture gardening. Mycorrhizal fungi system is like your roads, your banks, all of those types of things. So when your government talks about essential businesses and why we're keeping essential businesses open, this is what mycorrhizal fungi does for your plants. It means that you have access, they have access to the grocery stores. Now, what happens in mycorrhizal fungi is it starts to build a web or a system, a network of places for nutrients to travel and to exchange, right? So I've got too much protein over here, let's call it that. I've got too much metal of some kind over here. I need the metal, I need the protein. Now we can switch, we can trade, we can share, we can take from each other. One has too much, but you gotta have banks, you gotta have roads, you gotta have pools, you gotta have, all of the different things that those types of things need access to.
So if someone comes out to their garden, or maybe they've put a couple of plants into a pot, and they see, something like that, what do they do?
Leave it alone.
Leave it alone.
Leave it alone, and cheer for it. And some of them,
like
those red ones, sometimes they can turn into this thing. It's called It's called a blood fungi, which is kind of fun. It starts to grow this red cover, right? And then if you touch it, it makes a pool and it looks like blood, isn't it? So I don't know. We've learned to play with the fungi out at the learning garden and just
literally
touch it and play with it and get to know it. But it's essential, and it's very essential for us to talk about that. That's the reason why we use so much of the mulch. That's really the top reason, because we're trying to build that fungi in the soil in addition to keeping moisture in the soil and things like that. So those are important things to keep in mind. Now, I talked about weeding. I talked about another thing that you're going to start to run into is you're going to begin to see your squash blossoms. So come this way. See my squash blossoms here?
Now, how long ago did you plant this plant?
I don't have the answer to that question.
2 or 3 weeks?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure.
And now the flowers or blossoms are here.
It's flowering season. So the best gardens have got all their plants in ready to flower when flowering season gets here, or at least as a level of succession. Okay, so now while we're talking about squash blossoms, let's talk about a couple of things. You're going to have male and female squash blossoms. The first set of squash blossoms that come off are the male ones. That's what we pretty much have right now. Then you're going to need, as the plant begins to grow, you're going to run into the female squash blossom. Now, the female and the male are the ones you need. You have to have both on each plant. You're going to have a higher level of production if you were to do some hand pollinating. So take a Q-tip from the male to the female, yada, yada. I haven't gotten involved in that. Haven't had a problem. Have lots of pollinators. Let that be, right? However, I do like to use the male squash blossoms if we can, if we have lots of them, to make sure that we have some good edible squash blossoms in the house for Joe to cook. And they're delicious, okay? So don't be afraid to cut off your male squash blossoms and use them for food. They make great, I know some people that use them for pizza. Very, very, very tasty. So that's one thing to keep in mind about squash blossoms.
You mentioned systems, and you mentioned that there are folks that will take a Q-tip and do the pollinating manually, but
Sure.
One of the ways that you use a system is to plant purposefully plenty of,
Do all of that for us.
so that the bees and the wasps do the work.
Yeah, so they'll do all of that for us, and yes, don't make sure you don't cut off all of your male squash blossoms if you're using them. Use the male and the female. Now, other things to know about squash: since your squash is beginning to blossom, it's also time to begin having the conversation about how to keep your squash to where they continue to stay alive, because in a warm, wet climate like ours, we deal with the mildew mold. I've talked about that. And we also deal with squash vine borers. Now, everybody may deal with squash vine borers, but I know for sure in Zone 9B that we do. So some of the things that we're talking about, not just squash vine borers, but caterpillar season. Starting with the squash vine borers, I want to go over here and, okay, let's just start with mold first, mold and mildew. The best thing you can do for mold and mildew is to make sure that your plants have plenty of air, so when that wind blows through, it dries the leaves out, and make sure that you are doing everything you can to not, you're doing everything you can to not spray the top leaves. And
Spray with
water. Water. Now, things that you can use to deal with the squash vine borer. The caterpillars that are happening right now in general, you just kind of ignore. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but just putting those other caterpillars aside, we're going to ignore them right now. Squash vine borers, however, can really take your plant out, especially a bushing squash plant. A bushing squash plant is not going to be able to get away from the start of where the squash vine borer entered your plant and is now taking things out. One of the first things you can do for a squash vine borer is come out and look at your garden in the mornings early before you go to work. If you're still going to work, if you're not going to work, do it before you get to your desk and work in the morning at the house. Come out and check for the squash vine borer goes into the vine of the plant. So it'll make a little hole, and then it'll plant its eggs inside the squash vine. Then the egg hatches and puts a caterpillar, the larva, inside the squash vine, where it then eats itself big enough to hatch and come out like a little red bug, a little red beetle, basically. So what you're trying to do is keep the larva from eating up all of the inside of your squash vine, so that your squash vine won't have a healthy plant that then produces squash. The farther the plant can get away from where the little caterpillar was inside its vine and stay alive, the more likely it is to still put on plenty of fruit. So if you're dealing with vining squash, it's not that big of a deal. Clearly you want to keep the plant as healthy as possible, but it's not as big of a deal as if you're dealing with squash blossom bushes. And so that's what you're talking about, your zucchini, your yellow squash, your little patty pan squash or scalloped squash some people talk about. That's like these kinds of things. First step is squish them. When I came out here this morning, I saw one of these beetles. It's got red wings with a black like diamond on its back. Look it up, squash vine borer beetle. The actual squash vine borer. You're not looking for the caterpillar or the larvae. You're looking for what the insect actually looks like. Kill it, because that's the guy or gal that are laying babies all over the place, or putting babies inside your squash vine. If you see the hole in the squash vine, and I don't, most of mine haven't really even, like, I'm not 100% sure this is what we're dealing with, but potentially that's what's happened to this one right here, which is why and for me, the roly-polies are going to eat what's left over, because that's their job to clean it up. But really, what you're trying to do is catch it before it gets inside there and plants those babies. So you could even, with something like this, kind of open it up a little bit and maybe clean it out, clear it out. That's an option available for you.
Is that hole on the side of the vine?
It could be. It could just be that it's, something else. But you're looking, the really first and most important thing to do is to look for that red beetle. Because if you can kill that red beetle, see, there's it's hard to say for sure whether that's a squash vine borer making a hole in there and planting its eggs,